Welcome to Equity in Every Drop, a podcast from Waterkeeper Alliance, where we host conversations examining the relationship between water, climate change, and environmental justice. So whether you're a seasoned environmental advocate or just dipping your toes into these issues, we hope you will join us as we amplify our mission to protect everyone's right to clean water. Let's jump right in. Welcome back and thank you for joining us on our fourth episode of Equity in Every Drop. Today we are discussing coal ash, a dangerous byproduct from the already dangerous practice of coal combustion. We will be joined later by Brandon Jones of Catawba Riverkeeper in North Carolina, but our first guest today is Dan Estrin, General Counsel and Legal Director of Waterkeeper Alliance. Dan, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thanks, Tom. Really good to be with you.
It's great to see you. So let's start at the top and tell me what coal ash is. I think of coal as being a problem when it's being burned, but I never thought about the byproduct. And I think of it being like a respiratory and an air pollution problem, but it's got this whole other facet. So please walk me through what coal ash is.
Yeah, simply put, coal ash, or CCR, coal combustion residuals, as they're referred to by the utility industry and regulators, is the waste product that's left behind after coal is burned to produce electricity. Coal ash is a broad and general term, and there are different types or categories of coal ash depending on where in the process they're created or captured, but they are all collectively referred to as CCR or coal ash. And because of our country's long history of using coal to generate electricity, there's an almost unimaginable amount of coal ash that has historically been unsafely disposed of, and that regulators and environmental groups like Waterkeeper Alliance are trying to get cleaned up.
Yeah. So it is an ongoing threat, but it's also a real legacy contamination issue as well.
It is. Even now in 2024, when we've been steadily reducing our reliance on burning coal to generate electricity, we're still producing about 100 million tons of coal ash in the United States every year. So that makes it one of the largest industrial waste streams in the country. And I want to emphasize that number, 100 million tons. It's just an enormous amount of waste being generated every single year.
Oh my God, that's not factoring in the damage that the already existing mountains of coal ash are. Wow, that's staggering. So let's talk about why this is a problem for the environment and what threats this poses to the environment, because I think I clearly understand why I don't want to live next to a coal power plant for my lungs and for the sake of clean air. But tell me what threats coal ash pose to the environment.
So coal ash is unfortunately a combination of very toxic, carcinogenic, and radioactive substances, including heavy metals such as arsenic, lead, mercury, cadmium, and selenium, hexavalent chromium, which is a water-soluble and extremely toxic substance and a proven Category 1 human carcinogen. And it also contains radioactive elements like uranium and thorium. On top of its dangerous properties, a primary reason coal ash is so dangerous both to the environment and people is that for many decades, really from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution all the way up until 2015, the federal government did not meaningfully regulate coal ash at all and left regulation, to the extent there was any, to the states, which allowed it to be disposed of in incredibly irresponsible ways, leaving people and wildlife exposed to its dangerous constituents. So the vast majority of coal ash generated over all of these decades has been dumped directly into water in what are known as coal ash impoundments or ponds, or alternatively into coal ash landfills, just big holes in the ground with no liners where they're exposed to all of the elements. So this means there's nothing to stop all of these dangerous toxins and carcinogens from leaking or leaching into nearby waters or groundwater.
That's terrifying. I've been doing a little bit of research about this. I saw that there are different ways to store this. And I get the sense that mixing it with water is actually like the worst way to do this. This is like putting it in an unlined pit dry is bad, but are there good ways to handle this? Are there better or worse ways? They seem like they're all bad, but
The best thing we can do is to stop producing the stuff, right? And we need to stop burning coal for several reasons. One of them is that we really don't have a good way to manage the waste product that's produced, this coal ash. The only responsible way really to store coal ash, to dispose of it, is in a manner that will ensure that it doesn't come in contact with water, that it stays dry, and that it isn't exposed to other elements either, such as wind, because wind can pick up coal ash dust, which also contains all those same contaminants that I mentioned, and transport it into water, into communities where it can be breathed in. So the only way really to safely dispose of it is in the same way we dispose of other hazardous materials, which is making sure it stays dry, making sure it's in synthetically lined landfills that are also capped so water can't infiltrate into the coal ash. And that makes it very expensive.
And do I have this correctly that it's not considered hazardous?
It is not treated as a hazardous waste with respect to how the government requires that it be disposed of, even though it has the characteristics of hazardous waste. So this is an anomaly in the way our government has treated this waste stream and several others, where it's almost like a too big to regulate approach or too expensive to regulate. And this gets into all kinds of other policy problems, regulatory capture, where you have the government agencies that are supposed to be protecting human health and the environment, yielding to the concerns of industry and allowing industry to externalize their production costs, which means the rest of society, we the people, have to pay those prices in terms of our health and our environment.
Yeah, that's what we call that, the externalizing the cleanup costs.
Regulatory capture, where our regulators are unduly influenced by the industries that they are required by law to be regulated.
So let's talk a little bit about the threat that this poses to communities. It seems like a whole different bear than just the air pollution.
It is. The main concerns here are water and air pollution. I would first note that the people who face the most significant threats from coal ash exposure are the same folks who also face numerous threats from exposure to a wide variety of pollutants, because they tend to live in areas with higher concentrations of industrial pollution. We call these communities frontline or fence line communities because people with more resources are typically better able to oppose development of industrial pollution sources near their homes, in their neighborhoods, while less affluent people often lack the resources to protect themselves from pollution. So it's typical to find power plants operating in less affluent areas and neighborhoods in our country, where you might also find other pollution sources like factories or concentrated animal feeding operations, also known as factory farms. And exposure to numerous pollution sources compounds the health risks these communities face. And it's typical to find higher rates of cancer and illness in these communities. As far as the specific threats to communities from coal ash, water pollution is probably the most significant, as many of these communities are in rural areas and rely on groundwater as their drinking water source. And there are many instances we've found where coal ash disposal sites are not only leaching into underlying groundwater, but where the coal ash is actually in constant contact with groundwater. And groundwater, like surface water, moves underground, sometimes more slowly than surface water, but it does flow and move. So once you have those contaminants in groundwater, it can easily contaminate people's groundwater supplies. And one of the big concerns here is that many of the toxic constituents in coal ash are tasteless and odorless and colorless and invisible to the human eye. So unless the water is tested in a certified lab, which is expensive again, and a lot of these folks don't have the resources, there's really no way for the communities to know that they're being poisoned by their own drinking water wells. And then, as I mentioned earlier, another big problem with coal ash is that, and this is more in the case where it's landfilled, is it often becomes airborne in the wind and gets spread around communities, where it can contaminate water, but it also contributes to particulate matter pollution, known as PM 2.5. These fine coal ash dust particles can travel long distances and penetrate deep into the lungs and the bloodstream, causing respiratory and cardiovascular issues. And this is a significant problem as millions of people live within just a few miles of a coal ash disposal site. One other note, and this is fairly recent information that we've gotten through the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, is that coal ash is sometimes used as fill for development projects. Instead of trucking in clean soil, the utilities can actually sell coal ash, particularly fly ash, to developers to use as fill in their projects. And this includes housing projects. So you'll have whole neighborhoods that are constructed on top of coal ash that's used as fill. And in a recent report, EPA revealed that the risk to those communities from radioactivity in that coal ash is much higher than had previously been appreciated. We are still assessing that. We recently provided comments to EPA on a rulemaking that it was undergoing relating to that very important issue and to the need to ensure that this coal ash is not used irresponsibly as fill.
Yeah, you can imagine that there would be, I don't want to cast judgment on anyone seeking these opportunities, but there's probably a lot of people who are saying, let's do something with this product that we have too much of that we can't do anything with. Let's try to put it in X, Y, and Z. And I wouldn't want my house built on anywhere near coal ash. It sounds terrible. And I'm claiming ignorance. I knew all of the issues with it. When you're saying radioactive, that part hadn't occurred to me, as if it wasn't bad enough. You throw radioactive in there as well. And it's frightening, terrible stuff. And also just really terrifying. I know I've said it already, but that it's odorless and tasteless. So it sounds like you only know it's happening once you have these adverse health effects. It's almost when it's too late is when you can really detect it. Am I right in saying that? Or
yeah, that's generally true. The other possibility, and this has certainly happened, is groups like Waterkeeper Alliance or our partners or our riverkeepers that are located near a power plant, a coal burning power plant, may do some sampling, can do groundwater testing, and if it determines that there's groundwater contamination, we would certainly notify the neighbors of the need to have their water tested, get the local health department involved. But if there's not someone who's testing the water and checking to see the extent of contamination, people can wind up drinking contaminated water for years without knowing it.
oh my God, that's really terrifying. So this has been very helpful for me, and I hope for our listeners, in understanding what this threat is, what the situation is, and how it's so dangerous in so many different ways. Can we talk a little bit more about Waterkeeper Alliance's role in this fight? And I specifically want to talk about a case a couple of years ago that I know you worked on a little bit, not entirely, but can you talk us through, I believe it was with Duke Energy, and it was in North Carolina. Is that right?
Yes. So our Waterkeeper Alliance's work on coal ash issues goes back to around 2010. We had a campaign at that time known as the Clean Coal is a Dirty Lie. This was at a time when the utility industry was pushing the idea of clean coal. And there are so many reasons that that term is just
dirty lie.
Is a dirty lie, exactly. We were working in that campaign and working with many of our local waterkeeper groups, which include river keepers, lake keepers, stream keepers. And North Carolina was particularly problematic, and Duke Energy's disposal of coal ash around the state, where it was storing this dangerous waste in or near water bodies, streams, rivers, and lakes, and became a real significant problem. We were advocating with some of our partner groups going all the way back to 2011 or 2012, advocating that EPA needed to promulgate a regulation to regulate coal ash, which the federal government had never done. And as part of that effort, we became aware of what was going on in North Carolina and how irresponsibly Duke Energy had been acting for many years. Then in 2014 was a really infamous disaster known as the Dan River coal ash spill, in which Duke Energy, through real criminal behavior for which it was prosecuted and pleaded guilty to crimes, which is quite unusual for environmental violations that they are prosecuted as crimes, spilled an enormous amount of coal ash into the Dan River. And it wasn't a typical accident. This was as a result of real irresponsible behavior, failure to maintain their a dam and the plumbing, so to speak, by which they moved materials around at that site. And it caused an enormous amount of contamination, and it was a real ecological disaster. And very quickly after that happened, Waterkeeper Alliance is really, we're known for many things, but one of them is the utilization of aircraft to monitor environmental disasters, to monitor compliance, to look for violations. And we got up in the air very quickly when news of that disaster broke, and we did an amazing job documenting the spill and getting on the ground in the water, testing for all of the metals and everything that were spilled into the Dan River. And it made an enormous amount of news. We got national coverage for our video that we captured. And I'm really convinced that public awareness that arose from that spill, as well as some other earlier ones that were real disasters, including the largest one in history that happened in Tennessee in 2008, really were the impetus for us finally getting a federal regulation in 2015 that had problems and that we sued to challenge because it was too weak. But the work we did in North Carolina really, I think, created the foundation for federal rulemaking that we've seen occurring over these last several years. It also led to a huge amount of scrutiny for Duke Energy. Again, they pled guilty to many criminal counts. I believe they had over $100 million criminal penalty. And so that brought a lot of attention to Duke Energy's mismanagement of coal ash and put a spotlight on the state of North Carolina and how it had allowed Duke Energy to get away with that mismanagement for so many years. We brought our own litigation against Duke Energy. The state of North Carolina then brought litigation against Duke Energy in which we intervened along with some of our partner groups. And that all ultimately led to a huge settlement with Duke Energy in 2019, in which Duke Energy agreed to clean up pretty much all of its coal ash impoundments where it had stored coal ash in ponds or impoundments in water, basically. So they're removing over 100 million tons of coal ash to safe, dry storage. It's a many-year project, but they're making good progress. It's going to cost them billions of dollars by the time they're done. But it's a really good result where a lot of the work we and our partners did ultimately pushed the government to act. And the settlement included both the state of North Carolina, Waterkeeper Alliance and partner groups, and Duke Energy that resolved many of the legal disputes that we were involved in for several years.
That's amazing. I remember reading about, I think it was Kingston, Tennessee in 2008, which I know is not what we're talking about. That was the first big one. And I heard, I want to say it was a lawyer or spokesperson who was against this for the coal company, saying that the combustion and the burning is using 21st century techniques and the storage is using 8th century techniques. It's the most haphazard, sloppy way to deal with this obviously dangerous thing. So with that in mind, since Waterkeeper Alliance's judgment and this case, these charges against Duke Energy, has the industry changed? Is obviously still a threat. Coal in any form is still a threat. But can you point to any noticeable shifts in the industry or practices or behaviors?
Yes. And a lot of that is a result of the federal rulemaking I mentioned. In 2015, EPA finally issued what it calls the CCR rule, Coal Combustion Residuals Rule, which was intended to begin to regulate the industry and how it disposes of and manages coal ash and require it to clean up some of these sites. A big problem with that rule is that it had gaping holes in it that allowed for a lot of coal ash disposed around the country to be left in place. And much of this coal ash is literally sitting in groundwater. So it's just continuously leaching these metals and contaminants into that groundwater and not containing it in any way. So we, along with partners, and I'd be remiss not to mention Earth Justice and Southern Environmental Law Center and the Environmental Integrity Project, and our other partners who we've worked so closely with over these many years, sued EPA to challenge that rule. And we won that lawsuit and in the DC Circuit. And the DC Circuit remanded the rule to EPA, which worked on it for many years. We had the Trump administration, which sort of tried to make it even weaker, but they were dealing with the fact that we had this precedent from the DC Circuit that made it difficult for them to make an already too weak rule even weaker. And then just within the last 2 months, the Biden EPA issued several power plant rules, including a new and updated CCR rule, new coal ash rule that's much stronger and that we're much happier with than we were with the previous rule. The agency has addressed the weaknesses that we identified and that the DC Circuit agreed with. But it's really those regulations that are going to drive industry to make the changes you're talking about because they have no choice. But I will say that a $100 million criminal penalty against Duke Energy, that will also raise eyebrows. And civil litigation brought under citizen suit provisions will also leave industry realizing they're legally and financially vulnerable. So we have seen a shift between the rulemakings and the legal aspects where industry does seem to be accepting that they're going to have to clean this stuff up. And so we see, for example, Alabama Power, which had been really refusing, claiming that it was going to leave the coal ash in place, just within the last several months has had a change in position. Part of that, I think, is driven by the fact that our Mobile Baykeeper brought litigation against them, where now they are saying they're going to excavate the coal ash that they have stored on their site in Mobile. We see this happening where the companies seem to be getting a little more ahead of the issue, realizing that they're going to need to do this, and we'd rather do it before we get sued than after. But it is still much too slow in happening, and we also know that some of these industry players are still being recalcitrant. I mentioned the new rule that EPA just promulgated, and we just last week got word of the first lawsuit filed by a power company to challenge that rule. We expect there will be more. So this is an ongoing story. We intend to intervene in those litigations to defend EPA's new rule, which we think is absolutely necessary, from attacks by industry players and trade associations that are trying to keep industry from having to spend money cleaning up this mess.
Yeah, it sounds like you said there's been some great progress. There's some better rules. There's some great precedents here, but 100 million tons a year annually, this is definitely still ongoing. Thank you so much for being with us here today. It's been great getting this insight from you on this huge and awful problem. So thank you so much.
My pleasure, Tom. Good to be with you, and thanks for helping to get the word out.
Our next guest is Brandon Jones, the Catawba Riverkeeper in North Carolina. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us here today. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit about who you are, where you are, and what you do?
Yeah, thanks for having me. As you said, I am the Catawba Riverkeeper. The Catawba watershed straddles North and South Carolina in the Piedmont. We actually start up in the mountains near the beautiful Linville Gorge, flow from the mountains in the Piedmont through a few large metropolitan areas. Most people probably know Charlotte, North Carolina. It's our largest city in the state of North Carolina and the watershed as well. Then we flow into South Carolina, go all the way down to Congaree National Park. So we've got waterfalls and alligators. It's about 5,000 square miles. It's a pretty large watershed and very diverse.
Yeah, I should say so. Waterfalls and alligators is a pretty good way to sum it up. I'm in New York and we only have alligators in our sewers. Tell me what being the Catawba Riverkeeper entails.
Sure. So I'm the lead advocate and scientist for this watershed. And I'm actually fortunate enough to manage a team of staff scientists. I lead our organization's efforts to try and preserve and protect and restore the Catawba watershed. So every day is a little bit different. Some days we're involved in litigation, we're collecting samples, we're doing a lot of education. We're getting out in the community and just trying to get people on the water. It's really however we think we can be most effective in restoring this waterway.
Yeah. And speaking of that, I'm sure there are a lot of threats and challenges and a lot of things that keep you up at night, as there are for every riverkeeper. But for this, I want to talk a little bit more about the situation with Duke Energy and the coal ash spill. We were talking to Dan Estrin earlier in the episode about just the real dangers of coal ash. And just speaking for myself, who's more of a civilian in this, like, it just is, you think of coal combustion as being so dangerous. And just to learn that it has this whole other second life as this huge waste stream and just toxic byproduct. But tell me what was happening with Duke Energy in your community.
Yeah, the coal ash story, I think for most of us, really starts back in December of 2008. That's where it really comes on the map. And then the EPA goes through and they label which of these facilities are high hazard after that. And of course, like all of ours are. So we've got the Marshall facility on Lake Norman, the Mountain Island, Riverbend facility on Mountain Island Lake, which is the drinking water reservoir for basically all of Charlotte. We had another one right beside Charlotte on Lake Wiley, and then a fourth one down on the Wateree River.
And so you had one right on the, it's insane to me, right next to the drinking water supply for Charlotte. And how many people live in Charlotte?
It's about 1.5 million people use that as drinking water, and about 1 million people in Charlotte.
Yeah, that's insane.
Yeah, so that was the big fight. This is before my time. I've been Riverkeeper for 7 years now or so.
Okay.
But we actually filed this back in 2009. Sorry, I guess 2012 is when we filed that, our initial cleanup lawsuit with the Southern Environmental Law Center. So this was happening all over the Southeast. I think everybody was really becoming aware of it after the Kingston incident. We actually started our lawsuit in the South Carolina portion against Santee Cooper. They actually settled that within about 12 months.
Oh, wow.
And then we took the fight to Duke Energy in Charlotte, and that is the one that drug on for almost a decade. And so that was a very long and arduous process. I was fortunate enough to come in during just the last year of it and push us over the finish line. But I'm extremely proud of the work that the organization did in getting that settled.
Now, was this a situation where was there a spill, or was there something where you're like, this is just a ticking time bomb and we need to take care of this?
Yeah, more of the latter. There have been small kind of micro leases that have been found, and there's always just a little bit of ash in the sediment. It's just things that have settled out. But it was more the threat. And so as part of the high hazards and as part of North Carolina passing the CAMA, the Coal Ash Management Act, they had to do some modeling and basically show like what would happen if there was a breach at one of these facilities similar to Kingston. And it would have been fairly catastrophic. So that was the big issue for us, is that even though we're not finding these contaminants in the water directly at that facility, we need to get this out. The other side of it was particularly at the facility on Wiley, the Allen Steam Station. There were houses right up against the coal ash pits, and these were stored in water, and so they were pushing out into the groundwater, and there were numerous homes that had high levels of vanadium, boron, other types of heavy metals associated with coal ash in their drinking water. And then they were told by the state toxicologist they shouldn't drink their water, and then that person was fired, and somebody else told them they should drink their water, and somebody else told them they shouldn't. And then they were on bottled water for over 3 years, trying to settle with Duke to get city water put into their homes. And so that was one of the worst parts of this, was that they weren't able to drink their water safely. And then they were just living off bottled water in Belmont, 15 minutes from Charlotte, major metropolitan area. It was just completely ridiculous.
Yeah, that's crazy. And I think about this through a parenting lens now all the time. I have a 3-year-old, but like just there's enough to do it for yourself and enough of a pain and enough of a hazard. But then you bring in kids and trying to take care of your family. It's just awful. And there was a spill in the Dan River, right? Is that near where you are?
Yes. Yeah. So that led to the state, I think, really acting a bit more quickly. Our fight wasn't just with Duke Energy. It was also with the state of North Carolina trying to step in and slow down our case. And so the Dan River spill, I think, really kicked it. And then there was another spill on the Cape Fear as Florence hit. We were very fortunate. Previous riverkeeper, Sam Perkins, actually found a leaky pipe very similar to the one that failed at the Dan River that Duke had actually lost track of. Luckily, again, we didn't have a spill there, but it was very concerning to have all these major pits directly beside our drinking water reservoirs. That was just a huge risk.
So tell me a little bit more about that risk. Obviously, it seems like I don't want coal ash. From what little I know about it, I don't want it anywhere, ideally, but I certainly don't want it near my drinking water supply. And I'm not a bottled water guy. I'm New York City. We pride ourselves on our tap water. And we've got enough to worry about. We don't want to worry about our tap being poisoned. But describe for me and our listeners, like how that contamination or what that risk is.
Sure. So in coal, the main thing that we want is the carbon, right? We burn it, releases the energy, the CO2 goes up. That has its own issues, but less of an issue for a water activist. But there's other things in there. So heavy metals, selenium, arsenic, boron, radium-226 can be a variety of carcinogens. Those are then concentrated in the ash. And our ash has been traditionally stored in unlined pits. And those pits are going to be as close as possible to the plants because it's a lot of material. It's expensive to move. Those plants have to be located near water supplies or large water reservoirs because they need to pull that water to produce the steam, to produce electricity. And so all across the country, really, you see these large unlined pits of ash, which contains concentrated amounts of these materials, beside where we have to pull the water for large cities as well. As the rain falls through, or as they bring in water to actually keep the stuff from blowing out, it will pull some of those materials and leach them out. And so it can leach through the aquifer into either the groundwater, if you're living right there, or into the reservoir. We were very fortunate here. We've got pretty good soil for this. We got a lot of clays, so things don't move super fast. And so even though low levels of these carcinogens were moving into the reservoirs, they were essentially diluted so much that we weren't really able to detect them in the main water. And so at that time, our drinking water was still passing all the standards. We weren't getting any hits. But the groundwater on site was and is still extremely contaminated. It's not safe for consumption. And that was going into some of the neighbors' properties as well.
And that's like a well water situation.
Exactly. Yeah. So a lot of the neighbors at these facilities at that time were still on well water, and they were getting some of those hits, particularly vanadium, hexavalent chromium, boron. Yeah.
These names sound like comic book villains. They sound very daunting and awful, and not like anything I want to read that's in my water. And I'm just thinking about the members of your community and getting a notice one day that, hey, this is happening. You can't even really move, right? Because who's going to buy your property if the water is contaminated and you're trapped, right?
Exactly. We were fortunate, at least in the Belmont case, that they were fairly close to city water. It wasn't like a thing where they couldn't get a different water supply, but who's going to pay for that? And so that was the real big fight. Like inevitably, like they were going to get city water run out there. But was Duke going to pay for it? Was the city going to pay for it? Were the residents going to pay for it? And while they were dealing with that, they were stuck drinking bottled water again for 3 years.
That's insane. Who did pay for it?
Duke did pay for it as part of a settlement. It was a very long and arduous process. But yeah, special thanks as always to Amy Brown for kind of leading that charge from the resident side. She did an absolute tremendous job with a lot of her fellow citizens and advocating for themselves.
That's just so demoralizing. Not that part, but just the 3 years of bottled water and just all the plastic waste. It's a side thing, and just brushing your teeth and I mean everything. It's just
when you're worried about your kids, getting cancer, you're less worried about plastic waste for sure. But
no, absolutely. No, but not even just even personally, just being like, I got all these empty bottles in my house. Yes, the downstream effects of it for sure. And you're absolutely right. Whatever you need to do to protect your kids. We've talked a little bit about the science, like. What is the feeling in the community of having these, and correct me if I'm wrong, calling them ticking time bombs? What is this impact on the community?
Yeah, it's like most things. I think for the people that are right beside it, it's the thing they think about all the time. It's in their presence of mind. They're most concerned about it. But for other residents that don't live right beside these facilities, I don't think that most people thought about them at all. That's how our society works. And we don't usually think about where our water comes from, where it goes when we flush, where our food comes from even. And so until the Dan River spill, really, most people saw Kingston, maybe got scared for a little bit. They're like, oh, that wouldn't happen here. We did some dam safety analysis. We're fine. And that was really the line from Raleigh and from Duke that, hey, this could never happen again. We're safe. We're good to go. And then Dan River happened. And then Florence happened. And I think between those and the major flooding that we saw in South Carolina in 2015, there's been enough big disasters around here to be like, okay, we really have to do something now. So for the people that live right beside it, it was part of their everyday lives. And I think one of the big fights of our organization was really just trying to keep this in the news, keep this front of mind, and remember that this is still a thing. We still have to fix this. And it will eventually be the largest industrial cleanup in American history.
So let's talk about that a little bit. And I want to back up just a little bit. The way I guess the question I have is, why was it important to take Duke to court? You talk about some people who go, okay, we'll give them bottled water, we'll connect them to city municipal lines, we'll like put out that fire. But why was it important to go a step further and bring the law into this?
Duke Energy is a publicly traded company. Their job is to supply power at the cheapest rate with the greatest profit. Excavating this coal ash, moving it to line storage is extremely expensive. This is not going to be the cheapest way to store their waste. And so they weren't going to just do this just because it was more protective of the environment unless they were required to do. And so that's where our organization really stepped in with the help of Southern Environmental Law Center and a huge coalition, I should say, of other nonprofits and citizen groups. This was a major fight for many years with a lot of people coming in and out. But it takes a village. This is one of the largest employers in Charlotte. The governor at the time was a previous employee of Duke Energy. It was an extremely challenging case. So I think we filed about 9 years before we settled. Yeah.
And this is an aside, but this is a huge success, right? This is a huge success. And it still took nearly a decade. And all that time of vulnerability and exposure and everything else.
Yeah, that's unfortunately what we see often in this job is that's the pace of progress. It really does take a long time. If you're going to go the litigation route, it can take a very long time. And we could not do that work again without groups like Southern Environmental Law Center. We certainly can't afford to be in court for 8 or 9 years. Yeah, that only works if you have pro bono representation.
Right.
And I think eventually the cost of the court case for Duke, in addition to these major sightings and some actual good cases from the Supreme Court, the Maui decision in particular, really led to this settlement happening. Duke finally did agree to excavate almost all of the coal ash and move it to line storage. They had already required for new ash, I think since 2018 or so, based on some EPA rulings to move that to line or to start putting it in line storage. But the big lift now is digging up 50, 60 years of old ash. And the volume is really hard to even comprehend. So we're talking about millions, like 150 million tons. So if you think of a normal NFL stadium, about that size footprint, like the entire stadium, not just the field, and you fill it up with ash, volumetrically, you're getting to about 25,000 feet.
Oh.
So
how many stadiums are we talking?
I didn't do that. I should have done that math. That'd been better.
That's all right.
I was like, basically you take the footprint of a stadium and you just make that cylinder go up to the height of the plains. And that's about the volume of ash that they're excavating statewide. It's very difficult to even comprehend.
That is.
So it's going to take a while. The project is ongoing. They've got until I think 2037, and they're probably going to need most of that time.
Wow. And is all the settlement going towards the cleanup, or is there any other like remediation funds? Or it sounds like the cleanup is enough of a...
The settlement is the cleanup. So they are excavating all the ash. They're moving it to line storage. But then it's still hazardous. It's just a landfill now. It's not leaching. But they'll have to monitor that essentially in perpetuity, just like a landfill. So it'll still have, once it's capped, the leachate will be minimized. They'll pump it out. But I think in our settlement, we still get to see some of those results until I think 2070 or so. So this will be a project well past my time.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And so the answer to my next question was, what is being done to prevent this in the future? It sounds like they're capping it and monitoring it.
They're capping it, they're monitoring, but I think the biggest force here is just the economics. Coal is really just not, now that some of those costs that was originally externalized into the environment, have now been put back into the price of coal. It's just not really viable. Even from a combustion perspective, like their natural gas is just cheaper for Duke. And so all the new facilities that they're building are natural gas facilities now. And they're looking at nuclear, they're ramping up solar, don't have a ton of wind in our area. Obviously the hydro is capped out. There's 1 or 2 actual new hydro projects, some pump and storage that they're still building, but coal is certainly the past and just doesn't really make sense anymore.
I'm so happy to hear that. I never thought about it really with economics, that because I do think about external costs and corporate social responsibility a lot. I don't know why I think about it a lot, but I do, because it annoys me. I think it bothers me that even in New York City with Amazon, it's, you'll take care of the packaging that we send in all this huge volume to your street sidewalks where there's no space. But this is obviously way more toxic and dangerous. And I like that playing field, and maybe that's not the right way to say it, but internalizing that cost, bringing that cost back where it belongs, because it doesn't belong to me and you and to the communities. That's great to see that economics shift, because that really, in my sort of jaded opinion, is the only way things really move is with money. So we're talking about what's being done. I don't know if you have an answer to this, but what would you like to see done in the future with this?
These are big hills of coal ash. So I don't know where the technology is going to go. In the short term, you can just cover that hill with solar panels, and that's been done in some places. It's not a huge area, but it's enough to generate some. They already have all the transmission lines set up to these areas. And so that's one of the biggest, most expensive things. So I think that Duke is going to maintain these properties, and they're going to look for ways to use them in the future, whether that's solar, whether that's some kind of small pump and storage, whether that's small nuclear. I don't really know how that's going to go, but the transmission network is already there. And so being able to utilize that is probably in our society's best interest. But again, that's not really my focus as Riverkeeper. The other kind of weird caveat to this is that we still need coal ash for cement. And so it's the quality of it there really isn't worth it right now. It's got too much carbon left in it. They have to reburn it to recycle it into cement. And some of the ash actually does have some radioactive properties at the Marshall facility, so you wouldn't want to use that ash. But there's a possibility that in the future, this could actually be mined and reused beneficially. But again, in the short term and probably my tenure as Riverkeeper, I don't think the economics will work on that. But I would expect that Duke will most likely try to use these sites because of their transmission capabilities, maybe as solar, wind, or some other type of generation. For the Marshall facility, they're already planning to switch it to natural gas, which of course has its own problems. We don't have fracking in my watershed, thankfully, but I'm very aware that there's not a free lunch here and that we're going to have to make some trade-offs.
Yeah, that's the guy, the Secretary General of the UN. I always quote this. I think it's like the era of good choices is over. So tell me what's next for Catawba Riverkeeper. I mean, I know that the coal ash hasn't gone away, but there's been this massive settlement. The company has agreed to at least partially do the right thing. What's next?
Yeah, so coal ash has been the big push for over a decade. This was our organization's basically entire existence. This is all we did. We hired a lawyer, executive director. We hired a riverkeeper that was really good at communications. We went all in on coal ash, and that was our existence for almost a decade. And so coming out of that, it was once we settled, okay, what do we want to be when we grow up? And we went through this period of, okay, now that we don't have to work on coal ash, what else have we been ignoring? What should we be working on? What should the organization pivot to? And we're excited to look at other parts of the basin. We've been heavily focused really on this one area. Yeah. And so having the opportunity to look at other things, we've really leaned into restoration. That's been our new push and where we think we can make the most difference.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting about what you said is that what's so frustrating, there's so much frustrating about pollution and bad actors. It is that stealing of attention, right? I mean, that when someone is lighting the house on fire or has a ticking time bomb, that's the metaphor we're using, you have to do everything you can to defuse that bomb. You can't really work on some other really worthy projects. And I think it's a minor theft and a minor transgression in the big picture of all the terrible things that some of these bad actors are doing, but it's not insignificant, right? So it's great that you were at least now a little bit freed up to do some other things. That's another reason why these terrible companies need to stop what they're doing.
Yeah. So for us, restoration, we really had to think carefully about that. We're not an engineering company. We are not going to go in there and try and get grants to get a bunch of track codes come through and do some kind of stage zero, full stream restoration, anything like that. We have a lot of volunteers. One of our most successful programs is River Sweep, where we partner with tons of local organizations to go out on one day and we pull out roughly 40 to 50,000 pounds of trash in one day. Most of that is plastic and tires, a lot of plastic and tires in the water, but that's an important part of restoration. And we have seen that each year that we've done that, we get a little bit less trash per person per hour. And so it is actually getting a little bit harder to find. There's maybe more plastic and less of the kind of legacy trash, glass and metal and tires and appliances. We don't find as many of those, thankfully, anymore in the rivers. But it's still a big part of our work. So leaning into other types of cleanups. So we do tactical cleanups now. We go out to harder to reach places that we really haven't been able to get to with volunteers in the past. We've started to look at other types of high labor, low specialization. So beaver dam analogs are a really interesting strategy that's been successful out west, where you essentially build little fake beaver dams in areas that you want to restore. And you have beavers come in and create wetlands. And those wetlands, the entire Southeast, and especially the Piedmont, used to be covered in these beaver complexes. And then they were essentially hunted to extinction and then slowly reintroduced in the 50s. And they're still coming back. But that ecosystem is critical to hold our sediment, to provide ecosystem services that wetlands do as we lose them. Enticing beavers to come to specific areas that aren't going to mess with infrastructure is another thing that volunteers can do. And we've got some species of special concern, like the rocky-shouldered spire lily, which are really stuck in one area between two large reservoirs, and they can't naturally propagate up and downstream. And shepherding those seeds around to areas that they would have historically been able to survive. We've got some new areas that are now actually open that have been dewatered for the last century that we now have minimum flows on. And so trying to restore those areas, that's something that is probably not going to entice a large engineering company. There's not a lot of money in it. But that's something that volunteers get really excited about, and our staff is really excited to do.
That's awesome. I could do a whole other half an hour on beavers alone. They're so amazing. They really are so incredible. But with that in mind, Brandon, I don't want to take up any more of your time. This has been so great talking to you today. And just as a citizen of the world, thank you so much for your work holding polluters accountable and also working to restore all of these natural areas. It's really so great. And I say this all the time, but the best part of my job is getting to talk to riverkeepers. So thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Waterkeeper Alliance podcast, Equity in Every Drop. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform and visit waterkeeper.org to learn how you can get involved and help support our mission to make waterways cleaner, healthier, and accessible to all. Every drop counts. Until next time, I'm Thomas Hynes. Thanks for listening.